Okay, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. This is episode 52. And this is what we're calling our podcast owner's manual. And again, we're doing these in little bite-sized chunks so that in the future we can come back and make any tweaks or updates as things change or improve or grow or something new happens. We can come back and just isolate and update a certain part of the podcast instead of trying to update the entire thing. And they're in small bite-sized chunks so that they're easy to adapt and put into place right away. Show notes include all of the notes that I'm using, so you can rest assured you don't have to write anything down. You can just look at the show notes and everything's there for you. Also, you can head over to howtopodcast.ca. Remember, that's a Canadian website. howtopodcast.ca. Links in the show notes. Jump over there and you'll also find more information as well. So, last episode we talked about nailing down your topic. If you haven't heard that, go back there and check out that, episode 51. Episode 52, we're going to talk about naming your podcast here on the How to Podcast series. Here we go. So in real estate, it's location, location, location. In podcasting, it's name, name, name. What are you going to name your podcast? What are you going to call this new creation that you're making? So I have 6 things I want to point out to you today to consider when you're naming your podcast. Again, everything's in the show notes. But there's some thoughts around naming your podcast. And what I've noticed is even some of the gurus, some of the experts, I've been doing this forever, go back and play with their names of their podcast over and over and over and over. Like they buy domains and website addresses and create social media and then change their mind and reformat and relaunch under a new name. And they sometimes make mistakes. We're all human, correct? Yes. But if you can put some thought into naming your podcast in a thoughtful way at the beginning, the chances of you having to come back and make tweaks and changes, you can limit that by putting the investment up front. And that's what I want to help you with today. Naming your podcast. What are you going to call this thing? When naming your podcast, it's important to consider these 6 things. Ready? Here we go. Number 1, relevance. Choose a name that is relevant to your podcast content and your podcast's theme. This will help your audience understand what they can expect from your show. Is the name that you're thinking about, is it relevant? Think about it. Number 2, is it memorable? Choose a name that's easy to remember and to spell. This will make it easier for your audience to find your podcast and recommend it to others when you're not in the room. So if you have any kind of unique spelling where you insert a number instead of a letter, if you have something like for you and use the number 4 instead of the word for, it can be difficult to find you online if somebody does a search. It can be difficult for people to remember. They might choose the wrong way of spelling or typing it into a search. Keep it simple for people to find. Make it memorable. It should stand out. When you say it, it should be like, that's the name. Okay? Number 3, make it short and sweet. A shorter name is generally easier to remember and will be more memorable to the audience. Keep it short, keep it sweet. Number 4, make it unique. Try to come up with a name that is unique and distinguishes your podcast from all of the other podcasts in your field. This podcast, How to Podcast series. Now, if that is not memorable, I'm not sure. Is it relevant? Yes. Memorable? Yes. Short and sweet? Yes. Unique? Well, it's pretty specific. Pick something that distinguishes your podcast from everybody else. Number 5, avoid puns and wordplay. While puns and wordplay might be funny, an inside joke, or an acronym that means nothing to anybody else, it can be confusing and hard to remember for your audience. It's generally best to avoid any kind of puns, wordplay, behind-the-scenes joke, insider joke that only certain people would get. Think about it. Somebody's going to go to Google or go to a search engine or go to YouTube, go somewhere. They're going to be searching for your podcast. What would they type into the search bar? Would it be some weird acronym that stands for something that you have to explain? Would it be some weird combinations of numbers and letters? Would it be your name? Unless you are a famous person with a following, why would I call my podcast Dave Campbell? Who's searching for that? Right? So when people search for your podcast, it has to be something that they would type in. Think about it. Avoid puns and wordplay. Lastly, check for anything trademark-wise or a podcast name that's already out in circulation. I hear people say, well, I have a name for a podcast. I looked it up. There is a podcast out there. It hasn't been active for a while. I'm going to go ahead because they're not putting up episodes. And I've mentioned this before, and it's a word of caution, is you do not want to be associated with a podcast that has bad ratings, has poor content, poor quality. Don't marry up and use the name of someone else's podcast, even if they're inactive, out of just simplicity of, well, I want the name and they're not doing anything, so I'm going to take the name. You might be matching yourself up with somebody who's had a bad experience, and they might assume that you are that other person. So watch out and don't just pick a name that's out there and popular and being used by other podcasters. You can still be creative, and a quick search on Google, on YouTube, on your favorite podcast app, type it in and see, is there somebody else with the exact same title that you are in love with, and make a decision. Do I really want to be the exact same as somebody else with my name? Before finalizing your podcast name, before buying a domain site, a website address, before buying that .com or .ca here in Canada, be sure to make sure that someone else hasn't already stole your thunder and taken your name. And even worse, sully that name with a bad content and a bad podcast that somebody might think you are them. Don't do it. You don't want to choose a name that could get you into legal trouble, and you just need to be careful and do your due diligence and search. Choose a name for your podcast that is unique. So let's do this again. How to Podcast series. Relevance? It's the How to Podcast series. Memorable? I hope you can remember it. Short and sweet. How to Podcast. Good? Unique? Yes. Avoid puns and wordplay? It's pretty simple. How to Podcast. Check for trademark issues. How to Podcast. It's used frequently, but howtopodcast.ca, pretty good website address, I gotta say. Pick something that's unique, powerful, explains a topic. Nobody has to go through and explain what you do and what it is about, because it's right there in the title. Overall, it's important to choose a name that's relevant, memorable, and unique. It should accurately reflect the content and the theme of your podcast and be easy for your audience to remember. So, my question to you: what is the name of your new podcast? What is the name of your current podcast? I would love to hear your name ideas. Reach out through howtopodcast.ca. Again, Canadian website, howtopodcast.ca. Link in the show notes. Come over, let me know. There's a SpeakPipe thing on my website. You can leave me a voice message. I would love to hear your ideas for your name, for your podcast. Let's talk about it. Let's bounce it off each other. Go back and forth and let's see. And give it the test. Let's put it through these 6 check marks, these 6 things, and see how does your name of your podcast stack up. And let's start well. And let's not think, oh, I can change it in the future if I don't like it. How about we do the work up front and do it well? What do you think? Can you do that? I think you can do that. howtopodcast.ca. I'll see you over there. And we'll continue. Next episode, we're going to talk about the format of your podcast. What kind of podcast are you going to do? That's next on the How to Podcast series. I'll see you there.